This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. What do you guys want to talk about?
Well, we're at least back to a somewhat normal schedule. It is relieving to know that I will not have to spend the next 2 weekends trying to squeeze in 12 to 16 hours worth of wrestling footage to cover, whether that is classic or modern material. Tell you, as fun as it is getting absorbed into the wrestling bubble, it does eat away at a lot of my free time. What very little I have of it to begin with. But, I still like doing this. I enjoy getting the chance to come on here and sort of share my personal takes on pro wrestling. And, I hope you're all on board with it too. If you are, make sure you smash the subscribe button, if you're watching on YouTube, of course. Make sure to comment, like the show, and stop back to check out the FSWR channel every Monday and Friday. We got classic and modern wrestling that we discuss on both shows. AEW, WWE, WWF, NWA, territories, the full gamut. There's a little bit of something for everybody. Even though we all know everybody watches this show to hear me complain about how appalling AEW is most weeks. As fun as that can be, it does weigh on you after a while. It's like, how many different ways are there to say, yeah, that show sucked? I pretty much did that with TNA for the better part of a decade, and I don't know. At least TNA was like a 10-year train wreck journey of laughs. AEW, I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm older. I'm more skeptical by nature. With Impact, I always sort of held out a lingering hope that things would eventually get better because I was naive. With AEW, the history's there. I think the bloom's kind of off the rose with that experiment. Just watered down WCW is pretty much all we're getting at this point. So, why fight it? Just let that sinking ship keep submerging. By the end of 2023, who even knows if there will be anything left to report on with AEW. So that brings us to Dynamite. And, well, it was better than normal. Much better than normal, in fact. And the thing that sucks is that apparently their ratings hit a record low this week. Wonder what may have caused that. Could it have been putting the school children in the main event so they could do all their phony ballet dance theater routines? Call it a hunch, but, I mentioned it before. The elite segments aren't necessarily segments that hook you in, if you know what I mean. At least not for the kind of wrestling that average, sane people enjoy. Well, I'm sure we'll have somebody report on it when they get to the breakdowns, but I'll be the first to admit, I pretty much checked out after the MJF segment. I had some mixed bag feelings about that segment as a whole, but when they were going to try and follow that with a girls' match, capping off with another one of those installments of Cirque du Soleil, my brain about fried around the 1 hour mark. I think the last 45 minutes of the show are going to be the ultimate telling factor with what the real issue is with Dynamite. Aside from the fact that the shows have just been fucking rotten for God knows how long now. Pretty much 3 years. Although there was that one period about a year ago where things were looking up temporarily. And here we are about 12 months later, and they're right back at the bottom of the barrel from where they first started. Only difference now is that I think a lot of people are starting to recognize just how bad things really are. That honeymoon period we all talked about when AEW was trotting out some of those early Dynamites back in 2019, 2020, that honeymoon period has long since died out. And only now are wrestling journalists starting to report on some of those long-standing issues that all of us have pretty much been talking about since day one. Especially when it comes to the ongoing question of who the fuck is supposed to be running this ship. Because it sure ain't Tony. And again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time running the show into the ground. It was better than normal. But, there are a couple of bright spots. But like I said, I skimmed through a couple things after that MJF William Regal angle. And I about had enough of that once I realized the Trampoline Trios turmoil was going to main event the program. And just to let you know right now, no, I didn't watch it. And no, I don't plan on watching the next 4 matches in the series. Because I know what it's going to be, and I already see enough jagoffs exposing the business today. I'll run my entire body through a sawmill machine before I'm caught dead reviewing an elite match ever again. So for the second week in a row, we start with not the AEW World Champion. The hottest guy in your company right now. Fresh off of winning the world title at your pay-per-view 2 weeks ago. Yeah, that guy. The one that didn't make one single solitary appearance on last week's show because he was filming a movie. Yeah, so he didn't start. But man, oh man, if there's one guy on this roster we can never get enough of, it's the guy that looks like an interchangeable elevator mechanic. So he comes out to start, droning on with some WWE-inspired verbiage about the 3 constants in life being death, taxes, and Jon Moxley. I'll choose death first. And he's out there going, no one can outwork me, out-wrestle me, out-talk me, and out-bleed me. Well, he's certainly right about the bleeding part. And he's basically calling out the entire AEW locker room, saying none of them have the guts to fight him. So, of course, that brings out the return of the Hangman. Last time we saw him, he was left unconscious in the middle of the ring after taking a completely unnecessary flip bump off a lariat attempt from Moxley. And, of course, they're going to try and sell this entire story like it was Mox that actually put Hangman out of action with a concussion, when the reality is Paige is a fucking idiot that took a completely superfluous, phony-looking flip bump for no reason. He's the one that injured himself. So, of course, they fight. And while they're brawling, they got all the geeks filing out to try and separate them, to no avail. Because every referee, security guard, and or cop in AEW that gets assigned to do pull-aparts are completely fucking useless. They all suck at their jobs. See Wardlow beating up security geeks for weeks on end and never receiving any ramifications for it. I did laugh at the couple of occasions where the translucent-looking bald referee fell over and was trying to sell it before just standing back up to his feet again. It was like straight out of a video game where you hit someone with a move and then the computer lays on the ground for like 5 seconds before it gets right back up and then starts hitting moves on you. Just ridiculous. So, that was pretty much the opening deal there. I probably could have just summed it up as dudes brawled, what else is new? I mean, we see it every goddamn week on the show. It wasn't particularly special or intriguing. They did a separate brawl in the back later on where Paige slammed Mox into one of those overhead garage doors. Because Tony Khan apparently has some weird obsession with wrestlers and garage doors. I guess it sounds cool when guys get bounced off of it or something. I'm sure Mox falling off the stage and eating shit will make the next AEW botch compilation on YouTube. Can't even really make a snide comment about that one. I mean, it pretty much writes itself. If you didn't see it, I mean, the announcers pointed it out because it was so apparent. They couldn't even gloss over it. I mean, they'd have buried themselves if they didn't draw attention to it. God, Jon Moxley is just awful. Have I ever mentioned that before? If I didn't, yeah, he sucks. And I guess these guys are going to feud now. Never mind that I have no idea who I'm supposed to cheer or boo in that scenario. I have no idea who the face is, who the heel is, or why I should care. Ideally, Paige should probably be the babyface since he's the one that got taken out, and Mox never really showed any remorse for it. But who even knows with these people? Tony doesn't think that far ahead. He just pairs random people in feuds and says, we'll see what happens. And most of the time, it's terrible. Now, we did have one upside on the show this week, and it was the Dax Harwood-Bryan Danielson match. Surprise, surprise, something good on AEW involving FTR. Who would have thunk it? Now again, I'll go to my immediate critique right out of the jump. It's two babyfaces wrestling each other on television in a cold match with no story or prior announcement. And whereas you can maybe get away with doing that when you're working with underneath guys where you're trying to establish one particular player, then okay, it's not ideal, but it's not completely dumb. But when the two babyfaces you have in the equation are Dax Harwood and Bryan Danielson, who are far from underneath guys in the land of AEW, now you're starting to enter what the fuck territory. Even if FTR have been treated like underneath guys for the entirety of the year because of, EVP persuasion. So I didn't like that. But once I got over it and realized that AEW is where it is at this point and it's never going to grow beyond where it's established now, I could at least sit back and admire two great professional wrestlers going out there to do their thing. Again, it's hard to analyze any kind of story that was going on here because there really wasn't one. These guys have never had beef on television. I don't ever recall them interacting, period. There wasn't really anyone to cheer or boo because they're both likable talents. So all you really had to latch on to was the fact that it was Dax and Danielson. They know what they're doing, so if you watch it in a vacuum, it was a good 15-minute professional wrestling match. It was good. Like I said, I might even go as far as to say very good. At the end of the day, it didn't need to be any more than that. Again, we know both guys can wrestle. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that it was a cold match between two of their top guys that had no build. And it didn't even get the main event slot. They just put it in the second segment of the show. The floor brawling got a little excessive for my taste. It was right before they pitched a commercial. And because it was in picture-in-picture, you could clearly see that both guys were fighting on the floor for well over a 10 count. It might have even crossed the threshold of going into a 120 count. But again, as a match, both guys were serious. They didn't do anything ridiculous that would expose the business in any way. It was like watching a classic mid-card match from back in the day with two good, competent workers. I mean, this would have fit right in on that Starrcade pay-per-view that we reviewed a few weeks back. I don't think I like Danielson winning via clean submission, especially when Dax has already established himself as one of your better workers in the company, and he's already got 3 sets of tag belts he's holding on to with Cash at the moment. Now, granted, they're belts from 3 completely different companies that no one gives a shit about, but, I mean, come on. Like, if you had to have Danielson go over, did you really have to beat Dax clean to do it? Why not just go to a time limit draw? That way, if you actually want to revisit the program down the road, you'd have an excuse to do it so people could actually pay to see a real finish. Like, all you did here was beat Dax flatter than a plate full of piss for no reason. I mean, it's one thing if he's leaving the company, but if you're trying to get him to re-sign when his contract comes due next year, do you really think beating the guy clean via submission on television is going to convince him to want to re-sign that contract? Just asking. So then we had another low point in the program. as I directly wrote down here, dudes screaming at each other in a pointless sit-down. Here's what I can tell you about this whole exchange between the JAS and whatever accounts for the Blackpool Combat Club these days. If that faction is still a thing, I have no idea. People bickered. Everyone talked over each other. 2.0 has go-away heat with me at this point. Jake Hager looks like a fucking dolt with that goofy purple cap. And Flat Wheel Yuta looks and sounds like he ought to be working the customer service at the local Best Buy. Just picture him in a blue polo and khakis, and guaranteed I've completely ruined any future viewing experience of Wheeler Yuta for you on television. So that segment was trash. And I think it was supposed to get me to want to tune in to watch Final Battle. It failed. Then we had Samoa Joe killing some jabroni named AR Fox in a TNT title match. And once I got over my preliminary complaint of who in the fuck is AR Fox and why is he a thing, it was fine. Joe's great. I'm not breaking down any walls with that particular comment. You'd never know it, judging by AEW's piss-poor job of booking him. But yeah, that Samoa Joe guy, he's pretty damn good whenever he gets the chance to be. I personally don't understand why the hell this needed to go through a commercial when AR Fox is about as recognizable as the guy working the cash register at your local Walmart. Like, Joe should have just gone in there and smoked this idiot in like a minute. But instead, typical of AEW, they had to pretend like AR fucking Fox of all people is somebody we should take remotely seriously, which evidently ends up getting the wrong guy over when the objective should be to showcase how much of a badass Joe is. But whatever. Joe won with the Muscle Buster. Should have ended quicker, but I'll look over that. Then we had Wardlow show up on screen afterwards to bitch at Joe for how he won the title at the pay-per-view. And yes, I heard it. The audible boos as soon as Wardlow showed up on screen. I was afraid it'd come to this. I pretty much called it as far back as June when they absolutely butchered the fallout with Wardlow beating MJF at the Double or Nothing pay-per-view. I knew they weren't going to follow up on it properly, and I knew it was only a matter of time before all that momentum flatlined. And here we are in December of 2022, and now the people are healing Wardlow. And of course, they had to sell it like Joe's worried about Wardlow coming for his TNT title, even though 90% of the people are already cheering Joe to begin with. I mean, there are small pockets of those Wardlow chants still going on, but, I mean, it doesn't register compared to where it was earlier in the year. Compared to that nuclear reaction Wardlow was getting back in, like, May. Not even in the same stratosphere, dude. That entire feud with him and MJF was one of the more well-crafted slow burn builds AEW's actually done in company history, where the people actually gave a shit about it. And by the time that payoff came to the match, poof, no follow-up. And in fact, it got so bad, they actually had to take the TNT title off of Wardlow because of how bad the reaction was he was getting. Good Lord. Booker of the Year, ladies and gents. Never forget that. I also like the modern WWE presentation of Wardlow's Tron appearance where he finishes cutting the promo and then he has to awkwardly stand there on camera for another 15 seconds in complete stone-faced silence while someone in the production truck tries to figure out how to cut the feed. That was wonderful. We then had about a minute-long video package for Powerhouse Jobs, speaking of people they've horribly followed up on, wherein after he walked into what appeared to be a convenience store, the bottom text read, "To be continued," with Excalibur saying that we'll soon find out what Part 2 holds in store. I presume it's something more captivating than him robbing the convenience store. But I guess we'll find out. But then we come to the segment that a lot of people have been talking about. One that has left people sort of perplexed in terms of the way it was executed. And of course, I'm talking about the MJF William Regal story. And this was a very long segment, and there's a lot to break down with it, but figuring I didn't watch the rest of the program after everything they did here, including the ambulance angle that I'll touch on later, I may as well try and spend some time breaking it down, because I'm not going to try and sit here and argue against the fact that there were a lot of gaping plot holes with how they followed up on the Regal MJF story from the pay-per-view. There were definitely some things that left me scratching my head, things that weren't explained particularly well, or things that just flat out didn't make any sense. So for all the people out there that have been sort of crapping on this whole thing, I get the frustration. I think by the time it was over, most of us would probably be in agreement that whatever the initial plan was for this, obviously it didn't all make television. I'm thinking that a lot of what they did here between Regal and MJF specifically was all very last minute, which is a problem that I'm going to elaborate more on in a minute. In terms of what happened here, so Regal's in the ring to introduce us to MJF, and there's a giant sheet covering in the ring, obviously hiding a display of some sort. And I think most people were kind of smart to pick up on what was going on here, especially after MJF started running down the legacy of the old AEW belt. But MJF comes down, old title still around his waist, and he starts kind of sort of laying out their blueprint for how everything came together at the Full Gear pay-per-view, why William Regal turned on Moxley, why he joined with MJF to help him win the title, blah, blah. And from what I gathered here, here's basically what he said. He said that Regal sent him an email back when the firm had laid him out on television. I think that was the big closer where Morrissey had slammed MJF through the timekeeper's table after he tried running out to tell Stokely Hathaway to hit the bricks. So apparently in that email, Regal had told MJF that after their in-ring confrontation, where Regal said that he wanted MJF to be the best villain wrestling has ever had, he still has much to learn. So after chatting it up privately, MJF came to the understanding that Regal has a great mind for the business, and that they devised a plan so that when MJF won the title at Full Gear, he could do so by leaving Moxley with scarring, hence the utilization of the brass knucks, which, they could have achieved the same thing with using the diamond ring, but nevertheless. And as for the firm, he basically blew them all off as schmucks and washed his hands of that entire situation, which I'm certainly not going to complain about. That faction is a dead-in-the-water group to begin with, so the less we ever have to mention that whole debacle, the better. So then he gets to the part where he starts admonishing the AEW title and all the previous title holders because, and this is more or less true, all the previous AEW world champions have been fucking garbage. CM Punk, you can't even really qualify him as part of the conversation because out of his 2 title reigns, he never actually had one single solitary title defense. But MJF doesn't want to associate himself with said fucking garbage, so he tosses the AEW belt out to the floor so they can unveil the new belt under the giant sheet. And it's essentially the same belt, just with a Burberry strap. And of course, that fits along perfectly with MJF's scarf gimmick, so it was a cute touch. And I absolutely agree with MJF not wanting anything to do with that old AEW belt because of the tarnished legacy with all the other previous rotten champions. Again, Punk gets an asterisk in that conversation because you can't even really qualify him as one of the AEW world champions. Yeah, he had it for a brief period, but 80% of that first run was spent with him nursing an injury. So does he even really count? I guess you can throw him in there as one of the failed AEW world champions on a surface level discussion, but I don't even want to get into that at this point. Anyway, so he starts burying a bunch of people on the roster, includes names like Eddie Kingston, Ricky Starks, Bryan Danielson himself, so you can kind of see the seeds planted for what they're eventually trying to set up. And of course, he gets into his whole tirade about his promise to be a long-term world champion and how he'll defend the belt very rarely because all of us peasants should have to pay to see MJF defend the title, which, well, I mean, the world champion is kind of supposed to be a special attraction, so I can't fully disagree with that motive. And then he kind of taglines it at the end by mentioning that he's going to use the world title as a bargaining chip when his contract comes due in 2024 before he signs with WWE. And then comes the big conclusion to the segment, because then he averts his attention to William Regal, who, by the way, has stood in the corner this whole time, barely budging an inch. Not speaking, not involving himself in any way other than just revealing the new belt. He was almost a completely non-entity in this entire segment up until the last 2 minutes. But it finally gets to the point where Max pulls out the brass knucks and he's trying to babyface Regal for all his input. And right at the point he walks behind him and teases that they're on good terms, that's when he turns and cold cocks Regal in the back of the head with the knucks and leaves him for dead. And of course, he gets down on his knees and tells Regal that he taught MJF that he had much to learn, when in actuality, it was Regal that clearly had much to learn. Because he tried to make a deal with the devil, and that was his gravest error. And then he had a throwaway line at the end there that I thought was cool. He basically talked about that first conversation that Regal had in the first email to MJF saying, whenever he decides that he's ready to show him that he's the best in the business, he can send him his tapes. So MJF kind of returned the favor to Regal here and said, when you're ready to be the best in the business again, send me your stuff. And, okay, I'll say this about the angle before I go on touching on some of the story plot holes in the whole thing. The actual execution of it was phenomenal. You know, they did the whole stretcher job. They took their time with it. You had Danielson running out there with half his gear on, you know, trying to draw attention to the fact that Danielson was still in the locker room getting changed when all this went down. Didn't explain where the fuck Moxley, Claudio, and Yuta were during the whole thing, but, I mean, we can't nitpick every detail, right? And for once, the announcers weren't obnoxious and goofing off trying to call something for a change. They played it serious. They stayed on it through the commercial break. They replayed it when they came back. And they showed the final send-off with Regal getting transported out of the building to what I'm sure Vince would be proud for me to say, a local medical facility. And again, I don't want to discount the actual angle because I liked what they did. I appreciated how they didn't rush any of it. They didn't immediately gloss over it when they came back from break. Granted, in hindsight, it probably would have been more effective to just close the entire show with it so that we had something to kind of hang on to for next week's program, but for what it was done well. Now, obviously, like a lot of other people, I have some questions. Let's start with the basic fundamental premise that everybody's still wondering about. The William Regal thing. It's one thing for them to have to shift gears last minute because maybe they were not fully aware of the fact that Regal probably wasn't going to be sticking around long-term with the company once his contract came due. But even with them knowing how long Regal was signed to a deal with AEW, if you knew Regal wasn't fully on board with sticking around for another 6 months to a year, why would you even go through with that at the pay-per-view? Think about all the gaping plot holes you've left open in this story now because of the simple fact that you didn't know William Regal was planning on staying. For whatever reason. Doesn't matter if he wasn't happy there or if he just flat out wanted to go back to WWE when his contract came up. Whatever the scenario was, you had Regal locked down for a specific number of dates. If Mr. Booker of the Year, Mr. I plan everything well out in advance, 6 months to a year, Tony Khan, was not totally comfortable in that working agreement with Regal, knowing that he was going to stick around to a long-term deal, why would you go through with booking something like this? Unless you had complete knowledge that Regal was going to at least commit to a 2-year deal so that all the loose ends in the story could eventually get pieced together, there is absolutely no excuse for them to shoot an angle like this if Regal is not actually coming back. I'm not even particularly disappointed in the fact that we're probably not going to get an MJF Regal pairing on television. I mean, as great as that could have been, I mean, we're well past that point now. What about Jon Moxley? Does he ever get his revenge on Regal for turning on him at the pay-per-view and fucking him out of the belt? Does he ever get his chance to get physical with Regal one time so he can get some kind of payoff for everything that happened? Because here's the thing with Moxley. Never once in this entire promo did MJF ever explain why Regal specifically fucked over Moxley, which is kind of the key factor in everything that went down at the pay-per-view, right? That's the main story. That was the giant gaping hole that we were kind of waiting 2 weeks to hear about. They just glossed right over it here. And they said they wanted to leave some scarring on Moxley by using the brass knucks, but okay, then why? I mean, it doesn't explain anything. Why did Regal all of a sudden decide that not only did he want to help MJF win the world title, but he also wanted to simultaneously screw Moxley over? I don't know. They never addressed it. No, I can maybe gather something rational in my head, like Regal realized how fucking dreadful that BCC crap was and decided he'd rather latch himself onto an actual star that people care about. But I don't think that would be something they'd be able to say on television. I don't know. This is one of those AEW segments that left me stumped by the end. You know, and even with a couple of things playing in the background before I just shut the show off entirely, I still couldn't really focus on anything else that was going on after this. You know, I saw Ricky Starks kill some dude in like 30 seconds. That was cool. And I am looking forward to seeing him and MJF for the world title in a couple weeks on television. Even though MJF literally just got done saying in his promo that he'll be defending the title very rarely and that he's going to require people to pay to see it. Then his first title defense is on free TV in 2 weeks. Whoops. I mean, it should be a good match. I like both guys, and even though Starks has kind of been jerked around in the card for a long time, he's still one of their better overall talents they've got right now. I'd much rather see him than the Comedy Club. So like I said, that was about where I tapped out with the whole program. I didn't hate the show or anything, but it was one of those Dynamites where I just had a lot of questions coming out of it, especially that MJF segment. He did a great promo. In the angle where he decked Regal with the knucks, that was well done. But again, it was one of those examples of you can tell that either they did not plan out for this well in advance, or something happened at the very last minute that forced them to radically shift plans with where they wanted to initially go. You know, the random turn after Regal literally just helped MJF win the title 2 weeks ago, them not explaining why Regal screwed Mox over, them not addressing why anybody in the Blackpool Combat Club seemed to be concerned about this or where they even were during this whole exchange. And there's just way too many missing details here for me to say that this was an overall great segment. There was some great material in it, but as an overall package, nah, man, there's still some key details that are missing right now. I don't know if it'll ever get addressed or not, but the William Regal story is going to be one of those real eye-opening tales for AEW come 2023. If Regal winds up on television as early as January or February of next year and they completely neglect everything involving this in the MJF program, that's going to be what dictates whether or not this was an overall good story in the end. Because they put a lot of time and effort into building this up. I don't know, dude. The problem is, It's one thing to build to a story. It's one thing to build to a climax. But you got to have proper follow-up. Everything that happens or transpires after the fact needs to also tie in with anything that happens after the big climax. It's like the Wardlow thing I talked about. You spend all that time building him up, that slow burn tease for him to break away from MJF, and he gets that big win, and then nothing happens. It's like you get him over the hump just a bit, and right when he's starting to hit that red hot or white hot phase, you just kind of simmer and cool off with it. And now people don't care about Wardlow. What happens with this? What happens if we never see William Regal on AEW television ever again? Are they going to explain it? Are they going to account for all the missing details after the fact? Or is it just going to be a scenario where we have to gloss over it and that's that? I mean, the track record for AEW is never good when it comes to storytelling or delivery of long-term angles, but I'm willing to see it out with MJF involved. But I don't know. This one is just leaving me hanging on the fence. And it really could go one of two ways. It could end up all tying together in the end, or it could end up flatlining. I guess we'll see. All right, baby. We are now post Starrcade 86. It was a great time. I enjoyed the recap. But now we are moving on to bigger and better things headed into 1987. Specifically, our next stop being the Bunkhouse Stampede. And you know who's fucking amped for the Bunkhouse Stampede? Gorgeous Jimmy Garvin. That dude is so excited to get to work the Bunkhouse Stampede match, he's even sporting jeans for the occasion. Good old street attire, which was definitely out of the ordinary for Jim Garvin. And he's selling everybody on the idea that there ain't nothing better than the Bunkhouse Stampede, except Gorgeous Jimmy himself, obviously. And while he's showing off his designer leather belt, which I guess was going to be his implement of choice for the actual Battle Royal portion of the Bunkhouse Stampede, to which I said, "That is your weapon, Jimmy? You aren't going to try and bring an AR-15 to the ring with you? You can choose any weapon in the world. A chair, a pipe, a barbed wire bat, a fucking bazooka. And you chose a leather belt." Well, he is a heel. Heels that are usually supposed to be morons anyway. This promo was phenomenal, by the way. Talking about how he camped outside Jimmy Crockett's house while all the Bunkhouse matches were being signed. And when Garvin caught wind of that, he burst through Jim Crockett's door and asked for his name to be signed on the dotted line. To which the immediate question is, why was Jimmy Garvin camping outside Jim Crockett's home in the middle of winter? Better yet, sometimes it's best not to ask questions at all. For example, a question that I've been wondering about for weeks now, why was superstar Bill Dundee brought into Crockett Promotions in 1986 to do jack all of nothing? Aside from apparently beating Alan Martin in a short TV squash. That and wrestling Sam Houston at Starrcade for the Central States Heavyweight title. It's kind of fun listening to all the fans heckle Dundee by chanting for Sam. Probably one of the few times where people were actually chanting Sam Houston on studio shows. And all that did was add fuel to the fire, because Dundee absolutely dismantled this poor bastard. Ended up going over with the bombs away drop. By the way, my question is yet to be answered as to why Bill Dundee was brought into Crockett Promotions in 86. Maybe it was for what happened later on in the program, but we'll get to that. Or perhaps we could ask Jim Cornette, because, he usually knows the answers. And speaking of the devil, he was out here with the Midnights for an interview. Fresh off their scaffold match where 2/3 of the group damn near destroyed their legs. In the case of Corny, that kind of ended up being true. Now, of course, this was all obviously taped before the Starrcade show, so they were all still walking perfectly fine here. And Corny's taken a minute or two to plug the Bunkhouse Stampede. Says the bunkhouse match is on par with construction workers and blue-collar people grabbing random shit they find in the streets to start beating up everyone for 25 grand. To which I said, "Congrats, Jim. You predicted the 2020 summer riots across the country in all the big cities." I also like the bit at the end where he vowed that the Midnights weren't through with the Legion of Doom, and they would not mind traveling the globe to have multiple scaffold matches with Hawk and Animal if it meant ending their careers for good. Snidely remarking, "Yeah, I think the boat about sailed with that one, Corny." And of course, that ended up being a funny segue into the Midnight Express Mulkey Brothers match after the break, wherein one of the first lines Corny utters before bringing out Eaton and Condrey is the following: "Mulkey Mania's about to run wild." Poor David Crockett. He was doomed the minute those words Mulkey Mania ever crossed his lips. I'm glad Corny caught on to that too, because I popped when he brought that up. So it's funny. I've heard Cornette mention on his podcast how throughout the Midnight run in Crockett Promotions, they would have multiple matches with the Mulkey brothers on television, and Randy and Bill would both legitimately go out of their way to let Eaton and Condrey literally beat the shit out of them. Like, they genuinely enjoyed bumping around and feeding for them so much, to the point where they took a crap ton of risky bumps. And, we've seen a handful of them just on the studio shows alone. I would say this one was a little tamer than normal, but I remember watching some of those Mulkey matches where they would get dumped out to the concrete and purposefully take flip bumps onto their backs. And I remember thinking at the time, why the hell would you do that? Turns out they wanted to. That is how much respect they had for the Midnight Express. Now, one of them did take a slingshot out to the floor here, and his neck nearly snapped back on the middle rope before flying out to the ground. Aside from that one near-death experience, Eaton and Condrey just kind of toyed around with them for a few minutes before one got dropped across Eaton's leg. And then he proceeded to pin him by standing on top of his shoulders and then pulling his legs straight back. Literally something I'd probably be doing at the gym as a workout to stretch my calves. Bobby Eaton used it as a pin. Fucking genius. I also enjoyed the spot where Eaton intentionally flipped over a Mulkey brother onto him in a pinning predicament so that he had to pretend to kick out in desperation. No one could get away with that in today's business without making a complete mockery of it. Bob Eaton was truly one of a kind. God rest his soul. Speaking of such, the next segment put a smile on my face. We had Brad Armstrong out for a promo, and he's kind of stumbling and bumbling his way through a promo, for lack of better terms, just talking about the Bunkhouse Stampede. And who should show up to save the day but good old Bullet Bob, who got a massive ovation from the crowd here. And that was a nice little surprise. I love me some Bullet Bob Armstrong back in the day. A true class act that man was. The father figure we all wish we could have. And this is funny because the entire segment was Bullet Bob surprising Brad, which ended up cutting the promo short. And I'm yet to figure out if that was the plan or if Brad's promo was so ungodly horrible, Bullet Bob had to run out to literally pry his son out of there before it was too late. Because he didn't say anything here. He came in, hugged Brad, and then they both walked off together. course, with Tony Schiavone telling him to come back out later so he can speak with him. But I love this. Like, I wouldn't have been surprised if Dusty said, Bullet Bob, baby, your son is out there dying on the vine, Daddy. How about you go out there and get him out of there before he wets himself? You know what I'm saying? And Bullet Bob to the rescue. Because he got Brad out of there. So, good on him. At that point, we went to the Barbarian versus Paul Garner. Speaking of people wetting themselves, I am sure Garner was doing the deed right then and there, waiting for this massive behemoth of a human being to walk in the ring and kill him. I think my favorite thing I've seen in wrestling all year, they do one collar and elbow tie-up in this match where Barbarian pushes Garner into the ropes, and at that point, there is one guy in the crowd that just goes, "Ask him, ref." I cried. I was laughing so hard. That fan was trying to do Paul Garner a favor. Dude, just call it now and GTFO before it's too late. Unfortunately, that no-good jabroni Garner stuck around for the beating anyway. I also enjoyed Crockett speculating on whether or not Shaska Whatley would split the $25,000 with the Barbarian should he wind up winning the bunkhouse match, to which I said, you really think Barbarian gives two fucks about money? That dude would kick 25 guys' butts for free. And he wouldn't even need to use gimmicks. His gimmick is his head. So, speaking of such, Barbarian went over with the diving headbutt. And in another all-time Crockett classic moment, there's a pause after the bell, and David, under his breath, just goes, "He's a weird one." You don't say, David. That was followed with Shaska and Barbarian at the booth for a promo. And I'll be honest, I have no idea what the hell Shaska was rambling about here, but I did catch the line where he used the term bro. A word that I don't think I ever need to hear Whatley ever utter again on this program. And that's not a shot at Matt Riddle or anything. It was just odd to hear him say that. So I wrote down nothing about this. He did conclude with "dig it, sucka," which was also a stolen catchphrase at a later date in the business. I didn't know Shaska Whatley was such an inspiration for all the young kids growing up. Everyone's stealing his catchphrases. Then we had Tim Horner versus Art Pritz. The crowd was eerily quiet during this match, almost as if Tim Horner wasn't over. There were like two girls that tried to start a "Go Tim Go" chant. It very quickly died out. Horner did some fine chain wrestling for a couple minutes. He had exactly one facial expression the entire time, which read blank. And at the end, Horner went over with the bridging roll-up. I wrote down, boring. That was followed with the Kansas Jayhawks doing a promo, plugging the Bunkhouse Stampede, talking about how they're coming prepared with their weapons of choice, and Dutch Mantell is kind of the obvious one because his bull rope is part of his gimmick. Bobby Jaggers, it was funny because while he's cutting this promo on all 25 other guys, he's talking about all these potential weapons that guys could use in the match. And he begins pulling out several gimmicks offhand. And I have no idea where he was pulling these gimmicks from, but he's waving up 2x4s and cowboy boots. At one point I saw him bring up a crutch. And meanwhile I kept asking, where the hell are these weapons coming from? Is there just some guy laying on the ground right now handing him shit off camera? It was so wacky. But the message here was basically, the Jayhawks love that old school Southern bar fight scene anyway, so the match should be a cakewalk for them. Indeed it might be. Then we had Don Kernodle versus Randy Barber, which I also wrote very little down about. Hearing Randy Barber complain about hair pulling when a third of his head was completely bald, that was kind of funny. Even the ref was looking at him like, you're ribbing, right? Beyond that, it was another relatively pointless TV match. Kernodle won with the top rope clothesline after really having to muscle up Barber onto his shoulders for a running power slam. That looked like a feat of strength to pull off. That was followed with a relatively stern and somber Rock and Roll Express promo, because these poor buggers are still feeling the effects of that brutal cage showdown with the Anderson brothers. And while they're talking about how excited they'd be about getting the opportunity to work the bunkhouse match, the injuries they sustained in that cage match might prevent them from getting cleared to work. Ricky says they might have to take some time off, but they'll be back healthy before we all know it, because they love defending those World Tag Team Championships for all the good people. What a great set of baby faces Ricky and Robert were. Just two down-to-earth good men, not allowing for any excuses for that match with Ole and Arn. They know. It's like, yeah, we won, but damn it if we didn't win by the skin of our teeth. Because Ole and Arn absolutely demolished those two guys for the majority of that cage match. It's just a classic tale of how babyfaces can properly sell and work drama in professional wrestling. And lo and behold, that's why it still holds up after all these years. Telling you right now, because we reviewed the Starrcade 86 show, if you have never seen that match, you need to go out of your way to check it out. It's a great cage match. Among some of the best you'll ever see. Coming back from break, we had Jim Cornette versus a foam pumpkin with glasses. Spoiler, the pumpkin won the battle. And by that, I mean Cornette tried to jab his tennis racket into the pumpkin, and it utterly failed. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Tommy, what in the fuck are you talking about right now? Well, the answer is, for those that did not know prior to the Starrcade build, the Road Warriors shot an angle on top of the scaffolding where they threw giant pumpkins off the platform. And they used these as analogies to draw what Eaton and Condrey's skulls were going to look like after they got tossed off the platform. And when the studio crowd caught on to Hawk and Animal using pumpkins to describe the Midnight Express, this inspired everybody in the studio to begin referring to Jim and the Midnights as Pumpkinheads. So Corny came out here with the gimmick to infer that he is not a pumpkinhead and that he does not appreciate fans chanting Pumpkinhead at him. You'll be shocked to hear they all kept chanting Pumpkinhead. Aside from that, basically talked about how once the Midnight Express all successfully work as a unit during the Bunkhouse Stampede, they're going to bring the $25,000 check to Corny so that he can give it to his mama, deposit it into their personal bank, and then he's going to evenly distribute the money amongst all his boys. Seems like a rather generous thing for a heel to do. Now, I presume when he said boys, he meant Eaton, Condrey, and Bubba, and not the entire locker room. I mean, I know Corny's a fan of socialism and all that, but I don't think he was that benevolent. Though we had the Kansas Jayhawks taking on Phil Brown and Bill Tabb. By the way, I did not mention this from the previous segment, but during one of Cornette's promos earlier on, David Crockett was excitingly mentioning the possibility of Corny getting involved in the Bunkhouse Stampede. And throughout the entire show here, he was eagerly talking about how great it would be if someone threw Cornette into the ring so he can get whipped around by all the boys. I guarantee you that was the only thing that David Crockett cared about during the entire Bunkhouse Stampede. He just wanted to see someone kick the crap out of Jim Cornette. I don't think he cared who won that battle royal, just as long as someone beat Corny like a government mule. Speaking of such, that is exactly what Bobby Jaggers and Dirty Dutch did here to these two jabronis. They won with the double-assisted clothesline. I wrote nothing else down. Boring squash, Jayhawks won. That was the entirety of my note-taking. But then we cut back to Brad Armstrong at the booth with Tony. And, well, the nutshell summary here was that Armstrong had a scheduled match for later on, but he was willing to scratch that match if it meant getting the opportunity to get his hands on Bill Dundee and or gorgeous Jim Garvin, be it 2-on-1 or 2-on-2. And while he's talking, out comes Bullet Bob again to basically act as reinforcement for Brad. Says that he does not have his ring gear with him, but he is willing to do it in street clothes. So they both call out Bill Dundee and Jim Garvin to the ring. And of course, I'm sitting there the entire time wondering, did I miss a segment? What in the hell happened in the span of the last half hour that led to this point? Did Jim Garvin or Bill Dundee try to jump the Armstrongs in the back? Why was Brad so passionately angry all of a sudden and calling out the heels to fight him? I mean, it made for a great TV moment, especially when Bullet Bob went to the ring and it became totally apparent that out of everybody in that segment, Bullet Bob was the best in shape. So, out come Dundee and Garvin, and after a little verbal exchange at the booth with the babyfaces, the heels go directly to the ring to kickstart this impromptu bout, at which point Bob and Brad proceed to absolutely humiliate Dundee and Garvin, and it doesn't take long for the heels to try and hit the bricks after being thrown around for a few seconds. David Crockett, of course, being the most excited dude in the room calling it. I almost forgot just how great it was when David went from being color commentator to just full-blown mark. So eventually the heels get back in the ring to wrestle, once Dundee gets in his complaint about the Armstrongs working at an unfair tag situation because they weren't tagging in or out. Bill Dundee should see how they do tag wrestling today. You have a fucking seizure. And they do some stuff for a couple minutes until Bullet Bob gets a big tag and proceeds to fire away on the heels. And of course, his shit gets the biggest reaction out of anything in the entire segment. The heels are bumping machines for him. And eventually they're able to cut the Armstrongs off and start to go after Brad. They do the great fake-out tag where Brad is able to push Garvin over to his corner to blind tag Bullet Bob, but Scrappy McGowan does not see the tag. So he forces Bob back out onto the apron while the heels keep ganging up on poor Brad. And that is around the point where Tony has to start pitching to commercial. And while the heels are beating down Brad, David Crockett, the biggest fucking mark in the history of wrestling, screams, "No! We can't leave now!" Can you just imagine announcers being that emotionally invested in TV matches anymore? We can only dream we ever get commentators like David Crockett again. Look, I know he wasn't everybody's cup of tea. People have shat on him over the years for how bad he was. Dude, compare that to the dreck you have in today's product where all the announcers are boring, monotonous dorks that suck at their jobs. I'll take David Crockett any day of the fucking week. So this is great. They come back from break, and Brad is now in control of Dundee, and he's working over his arm on the mat. And after all that time where they milked the fake-out tag with Bob from earlier, finally they do a completely random spot where Brad fake tags Bullet Bob while Scrappy was not looking. And when Bullet Bob comes in to take over, ref just lets it go. He does the old, "Was that a legal tag?" expression, and all the fans cheer as if to say, "Absolutely. No cheating tactics used there." At which point, Bullet Bob tags back out so that Brad can come in, and then the heels immediately take control again on Brad. Man, what a geek Brad Armstrong was in this match. So a couple minutes later, they shoot the angle where Dundee uses the can of hairspray on both baby faces, and that leads to, well, essentially nothing, just an extension of the heat portion. And they're working over Brad for several more minutes. Dundee at this point is sweating profusely. Probably the hardest he's worked in Crockett Promotion since he came in. I mean, he worked harder in this match than he did in that fucking Starrcade match with Sam Houston. This was the night he said, "I'm going to earn that paycheck, brother." I also enjoyed the fans breaking out a Dundee the Shrimp chant toward the end. Of all things for the studio crowd to chant at Dundee, they used the word shrimp. Y'all remember when shrimp was actually an offensive term? Good times. So finally, it all ends up breaking down with all four guys. And right when Bob sends Dundee out to the floor with the big chop, Scrappy calls for the bell and throws the match out via double DQ, which promptly brings both Armstrongs over to Tony at the booth to conclude that the war has just begun. And for Bullet Bob, while he still has other projects to attend to outside Crockett Promotions, he will be back. And when he's back, he's going to finish the job with his son once and for all. No time limits, no disqualifications. They're just going to bring their 2 fists, 2 feet, and fight it out until someone is left standing. Nose to nose and toes to toes. A good old Bullet Bob quote. And Brad actually cut in a fucking fiery babyface promo here too, saying he was born and raised as an Armstrong and he's damn proud of it. And he may be winded, he may be hurt, but if Dundee and Garvin aren't laying in the back somewhere sucking wind right now, they can come back out and try to finish what they just started. Well, the heels didn't come back out, but I am sure looking forward to seeing Bullet Bob come back eventually. I always thought I didn't get enough of him in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Now that I remembered he stuck around for a brief tenure in Crockett Promotions, I'm really on board with that. It was a phenomenal last 20 minutes of the show. Again, I get the sense that there was an angle or something that they didn't air on this episode because the way they set all this up kind of happened pretty much out of nowhere. There was a segment at the beginning with Bullet Bob and Brad. They walked off together, and next time we saw Brad on camera, he was already cutting the promo on the heels, challenging them to a fight. So, unless they shot something that did not air on this episode, I can't really explain how this basically went from 0 to 100 that fast. But the actual stuff with all four guys was fantastic. You know, Dundee and Garvin worked their asses off here. Brad was a great underdog babyface during that whole exchange. Bullet Bob was on fire. Keep in mind, by this point, he's, somewhere in his mid to late 40s? He wasn't going in there to half-ass it. He was going in there to work. And he kept up with these guys just like it was the 60s and 70s. Just another day at the office for Bullet Bob Armstrong on this show. What a talent that guy was. I love going back and watching me some old Bullet Bob Armstrong tapes. That is somebody that you never really recognize how truly great he was until you go back and relive his career with modern eyes. I mean, I mostly remember him for cutting all those great promos in Smoky Mountain. Not to take anything away from his ring ability, but that man was the true embodiment of classic babyface. Very buttoned down, very serious. He loved the smile, but when the fight was on, the fight was on. And Bullet Bob was going to stretch you. No doubt about that. Yeah, so I love this show. Mainly for the last 20 to 25 minutes. A lot of the other stuff was kind of status quo for a Saturday night show on the Superstation. They were kind of in this weird transition period with the tapings where it's obvious they shot a lot of stuff before Starrcade already aired. So it wasn't the smoothest show in terms of story follow-up, but, you know, they set the stages for the Bunkhouse Stampede the following week, and that's kind of what the whole show was mainly centered around. And it looks like we're going to get back to our normal 60 to 90-minute programs instead of just the half-hour shows. So we'll probably be covering a little more ground with the NWA recaps going forward. And we only have a few left before the year rounds out, and we're headed into 87 before you know it. It's an exciting time. Because as great as 86 was, 87 had some great stuff too from what I remember. By 88, things totally go off the rails. It's a sad state of affairs, but, business was doing very well around this period. Keep that in mind. It's amazing how quickly everything goes to hell in a handbasket. So with that, we will move on to this episode of World Class TV. And this is where they began airing the tape delays of the Thanksgiving Star Wars event. And they were at the Reunion Arena for this particular event. They didn't air the whole show, obviously, but we got a handful of the prelim matches that were aired for this particular episode. There's plenty to get into, so let's go ahead and jump right into the card. After we, of course, mentioned the obligatory dude with no musical inclination singing the national anthem. It was probably about a 4 out of 10. I've heard plenty worse from modern musicians. At least he stayed in key. But the actual card opened with a 6-man tag. Black Gordman, Tonga John, and Boris Zerkov versus Jose Lothario, Mike Reed, and Johnny Mantell. And I believe we have reviewed roughly one of Tonga John's matches on a previous episode of Dallas TV. For those that did not know, Tonga John was a very young barbarian, before the barbarian became famous, of course. And I'll admit, it is very odd reviewing a barbarian match when he had a giant afro and wrestled in short trunks. The bare feet exposure was also a culture shock. Tell you what, though, he still wrestled like the fucking barbarian. Even a young, green, 30-something-year-old barbarian is someone I would not be caught dead trying to pick a fight with. Now, of course, the match had mostly all prelim guys, so there wasn't any kind of inbuilt story or anything. Lothario and Gordman had kind of been feuding on and off on the TV show, and they had a fun little exchange at one point. Lothario was doing all kinds of fake outs when Gordman was trying to run him toward the ropes, and eventually Lothario just kind of sidestepped him, so Gordman went flying out to the ring apron. That got a big pop from the crowd. I think I made some passing jokes about the Boris Zerkov experiment. I remember watching him in Mid-South when they had first debuted him as the fake Russian. Didn't last all that long in the territory before he kind of fizzled out. But, he was definitely around for a cup of coffee. Can't remember who they tried to pair him with. Was it Crusher Darso and Nikolai Volkov? Might have been. In any case, you'll be shocked to hear that the fake Russian did the job here. As per usual with these kinds of matches, things kind of broke down with all 6 guys at the end. And somehow in the melee, the camera totally missed a spot where Johnny Mantell covered Zerkov for the 3. Made even better by the 10-second post-match angle, where Gordman tried to confront Lothario in the center of the ring, and right as Mercer was trying to pitch to a break, all we see is Lothario and Gordman in the Mexican standoff, where Lothario ends up giving Gordman one stiff jab to the face, and then he leaves. Again, the match was just kind of a match to get some of the underneath guys on the card. Nothing to write home about, but it was a fun cold opener. Speaking of underneath guys who were nothing to write home about. Nah, sorry, that was a little too easy of a layup. I don't want to give the poor kid a hard time, but yeah, this Mike Von Erich promo, where all the Von Erichs are standing with Bill Mercer, trying to talk up Mike and get him over to the best of their abilities. Ugh. They tried. That is all I can say. We'll talk about the match in a minute. First, I wanted to address Mark Lorenz, introducing the Dallas crowd to Sam Muchnick, who happened to be sitting in attendance for the show. And of course, sitting next to him at the time was the, at the time, newfound president of the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team. I didn't bother to write his name down, but I did want to point out the fact that for some reason, Apparently, they thought this was going to be a wise decision to bring in Sam Muchnick, former promoter in the St. Louis territory through the 40s, link him with then president for a baseball team from Missouri, and they thought this was somehow going to get a positive reaction from the Dallas crowd. When I tell you they shit all over this, I am not exaggerating. The boos were extremely boisterous for this 30-second deal. I mean, on the one hand, I kind of understood the Muchnick thing because he had ties to the National Wrestling Alliance as president through the 50s. He was a name, people knew who he was, but seriously, they thought the Dallas crowd was going to cheer the president for a St. Louis baseball team? This was poorly thought through. Not as poorly thought through, though, as trying to get Mike Von Erich over. I'm only teasing. So, this match he had was Skandar Akbar for the Thanksgiving special. It was weird going back and watching Mike Von Erich wrestle again because, I don't know, it's one of those things where I almost had no memory of ever seeing him wrestle, period. But after seeing so many Dallas clips from years past, I almost get the feeling that I should have seen at least a handful of his matches at some point, right? I mean, I could sit here and rattle off all kinds of great Kerry, Kevin, or David matches if I wanted to. Mike, on the other hand, very little memory of his work. And I can't remember who I heard talking about him. Someone on a podcast was mentioning something about how Mike Von Erich was always sort of the odd man out when it came to the Von Erich lineage. You know, almost like he saw his three older brothers get into the business, and while he ended up doing it too, the passion just wasn't the same as it was for David, Kevin, or Kerry. And I don't know if he was necessarily goaded into doing it. I imagine he felt like he owed it to Fritz and his brothers to try and follow in their footsteps, but yeah, for whatever reason, Mike just never clicked with the wrestling bug. Like I said, the drive wasn't there, and you know, the thing that sucks is he wasn't a bad worker. He was perfectly fine in there with Akbar. His basics were solid. He had some nice babyface fire at times. His selling was good. Didn't have the greatest body in the world, but he looked like a grown athlete. He knew what he was doing. And everything he did here with the General was very basic. They didn't set any new gate numbers with the debut, but you know, the crowd was definitely behind Mike the whole time. They just worked a simple story where Mike outmaneuvered and out-wrestled Akbar. They gave Mike a chance to sell a little bit toward the end. And right when Akbar went to grab his whip from Friday, Mike turned that over into a schoolboy and then pinned Akbar for the 3 count. It was, wasn't a remarkable first showing or anything, but like I said, he was a perfectly acceptable pro wrestler. And at the end of the day, maybe that was the problem. Think about it. The other 3 brothers were at such an elite level, especially in the Dallas region. When it became pretty apparent that Mike just wasn't at that same level, kind of quickly exposed him. And I know he was only around for a few years before his tragic passing in '87. They kept him in that upper mid-card picture with his brothers through some involvement with the Freebirds, but by and large, a lot of his world-class work was very unmemorable from what I remember. He's certainly not talked about on the same level as David, Kerry, or Kevin. It's sad, but we talk about it so much in today's product, especially with, some of these second or third generation wrestlers whose family were in the business at one point. Some people just aren't bred for it. Just because you could hypothetically be a pro wrestler doesn't mean it's always in your best career interest to do so. Sometimes the second, third generation, it works. Other times, not so much. And with Mike, I just don't think he could ever carry that legacy of the Von Erich family. They tried with him. To an extent, he was over, but it just wasn't the same with the other 3 brothers. I don't know what the issue was. Just one of those unfortunate circumstances where not all the brothers were on the same page. Just kind of the reality of it. But we'll be talking more about Mike on the upcoming Dallas show, so I'm not going to run him up the flagpole every time we see him work. Just thought I'd get that little discussion out of the way now. With that said, let's jump to the main event. Tag team action with the Super Destroyers teaming up to defend their newly won American Heavyweight Tag titles against the Iceman King Parsons and the Junkyard Dog. A feud that stems from an angle back on television where the Super Ds pulled a little twin magic during a King Parsons match and stole a win. I can't remember. I think we saw JYD wrestle one of the Super Ds too, although I might be mistaken on that. Now, what made this match difficult for the heels to pull that little twin magic gimmick off is that the Super Ds did not have matching masks in this match. So their ring gear was a little more recognizable. Fans would be able to pick that out a little easier. And we talked about this last time too. I don't really need to repeat how over JYD was in Dallas. This was still about a year before everything sort of went to shit for the dog. And I'm not just talking about the physical decline. Even by this point, though, you go back and watch your JYD tapes, you could start to see that conditioning waning. He got blown up during the heat portion of this match, and the whole thing lasted all of 2 minutes. But, when you were JYD in the South, circa early to mid-'80s, you could commit fucking first-degree murder in broad daylight. The wrestling fans were still going to treat you like God. The match wasn't anything special, but it accomplished what it needed to. The people loved Dog and the Iceman, so they got to shine early on by working over the Super Ds. They built to a spot where the Iceman ended up getting posted, so he was bleeding for the last several minutes. They also did a great job cutting the camera to show the Iceman clearly blading himself on the floor, which was epic camera work. But that set up a great eventual hot tag for Dog. Crowd had a seizure when Dog got that tag. And they had a great deal at the end here where they tried to help the Iceman to the back so they could attend to his wound, which temporarily leaves JYD in there to fend for himself. And right at the point he starts to get overwhelmed at the handicap disadvantage, outruns the Iceman with his head taped up to a nuclear babyface reaction. And Bronco ends up throwing the match out after losing control of everything. And right when Ogbar tries to involve himself at the end, the Iceman ends up flipping him into the ring. And while the Iceman tries to grab a hold of the General, one of the Super Ds restrains the Iceman from behind, so Ogbar can light a fireball and set it at the Iceman's face. And of course he goes down selling it while the medical team all runs out to the back to check on him. And the whole thing's made better by the fact that the Iceman's got a giant strip of tape across his head to cover an open wound from a blade job he did. Just a broken, mangled mess he was in this segment. And obviously the fireball angle is a well-known angle. Most people have royally fucked it up in the last 15-odd years, but back in the day when smart people were involved and they actually knew how to do the gimmick correctly, and they did this stuff all the time, and the people would go crazy for it. So, it was a good story. It puts the Iceman down for the count temporarily, but we all know he'll be back. And since the Super Ds have now left him for dead on a second occasion, we also know that when the Iceman comes back, he's going to have a beef to settle with Akbar. It's actually the same thing they did with Hacksaw Duggan and Akbar in their feud from Mid-South in 1984, I want to say. Maybe it was 85. Might have been 85 now that I think about it. That's another great fireball angle that got over like crazy. Same goes with Ronnie Garvin's angle that's upcoming in Crockett Promotions for 87. Man, it's almost like great ideas could be replicated over and over again and it would still get over the same way. Who would have ever thought that? Don't need to reinvent the wheel for no reason. Keep it stupid simple. So, generally I had fun watching the show. Again, these were mostly all prelim angles and feuds that they were building up on television, so it wasn't a blowaway show or anything, but they set the stages for some follow-up programs for later dates, and we'll see how they round out the year after we get the last series of tapings from the Star Wars special. And as we round it out, just want to throw this out there. Thank you for stopping in. We will be back this coming Monday for our Back to Normal Monday podcast. We'll be talking Retro Raw and current day SmackDown. We'll see how WWE follows up with the Survivor Series special from last weekend. Will they bother to touch on War Games at all? We will see. Hopefully the follow-up is better than what AEW did after the Full Gear show, but guess we'll find out. I'll say this too. I'm still looking to program a big FSWR special at the end of the year to sort of go over my favorite matches of 2022 and kind of put the year to closure, I guess. There was a lot of shit that happened this year, both good and bad. Mostly bad. But, there's still plenty to unpack with everything that's gone down in the year 2022. So we'll make sure we plug something in so we get a chance to recap everything that's gone down in the last 12 months. But that'll be something that I keep prepping in my notes in the meantime. Until then, take care all. Peace out.